Reporting continues tonight here on In Focus. The first polling stations in the United States elections are expected to close within the next 20 minutes. Let's cross live now to our politics reporter, Ziyanda Ngcobo, who is on the ground for us, still in Atlanta, Georgia, one of the important swing states where the election board at the Falcon County will be hosting a briefing. In a moment now, Ziyanda, we'll be seeing the closing of some of those voting stations, and the counting really begins in earnest. What's the feeling on the ground?
Absolutely. So we're back to where we started, Thabo, this morning. This electoral board is basically like the IEC of this particular area. And so this morning they gave us a briefing. All voting stations opened on time. There were a few bomb threats at 102 voting stations, but they closed them and reopened them swiftly. And so far, there haven't been any incidents reported. As you can see behind me, security is tight everywhere. This is also one of the stations or one of the areas where the ballots are being counted. And so we expect then a briefing to take place just before the voting stations close at 7 p.m. today. And so that's just under 2 hours away from now. And then, of course, that's when the action begins, Thabo. Those watch parties, those different venues that will be waiting then for the various states to have their election results called. Of course, they wouldn't have been declared, but usually, based on the accuracy, the parties do declare a victory here and there. And so Georgia is one of those states that are very pivotal in this election. 16 electoral college votes, and we'll be hearing then from the officials whether or not there were any other reports across Atlanta where we were. Buckhead Library and Metropolitan Library, it was vibrant, it was energetic. People really being encouraged to exercise their votes, as this is the last day that America can decide.
That is a very important swing state there in Georgia, and one that could certainly be a decider for Donald Trump. You've been speaking to some of the folks on the ground, others willing to tell you whether they're going red or going blue. What's your feeling on where most of them are leaning?
It's very difficult to tell, Thabo. The areas are different, the dynamic is different in the more affluent areas versus on the more far-flung areas. The views do change, but you do get a sense that there's a difference, when it comes to some people within the Republican Party. I think that's something worth noting, that, some Republicans are wanting to vote for Kamala Harris because they believe that there's a section within the party that has become extreme, or there are some extreme elements that they don't necessarily agree with, and that's the nuance, I guess, of this election. It's not just straight down the line, but even internal party dynamics are also at play. It's kind of like the renewal faction within the ANC, so to speak. Even within the organization, there's a huge disagreement about which direction the party should be taking in terms of policy, in terms of the things that are being spoken about. And so it's very difficult to call, but what is clear is that women are an important element in this election, in particular because of those issues around reproductive rights. They've come out in their numbers, and women have been targeted, as we've heard from Georgia Stand Up, a non-profit organization. They've targeted women between the ages of 18 and 85 because they believe that the mothers, the sisters, are the carriers of life, and so they would be able to deal with the issue of the future of this country through their vote, because of course they pass it down to their children, their children's children. And so this is basically what some organizations have targeted in this election. And much like in our election too, voter turnout is very critical. So you'll remember that over the last couple of weeks they've had early voting taking place. That closed at the weekend, and now was the last chance for Americans to actually make their voices heard. So there's been a lot of push on social media, on the streets of Georgia, to get people out there to vote, in particular young voters. You know, at the one voting station, there was a real push to have first-time voters clapping of hands. You know, when you get in, you sign up, and if you say you're a first-time voter, you get cheers from inside, because it's very important for the young people. In fact, we know that Kamala Harris in an area such as North Carolina is relying largely on the Gen Z voters to actually show up and turn some parts of North Carolina blue, another swing state. So it's varied and it changes. You know, it's not a one monolithic kind of approach, especially when you're approaching or looking at a particular demographic, especially since we were at the J.D. Vance rally yesterday, and J.D. Vance has you know, some very extreme comments. He's someone who, for instance, doesn't believe a woman should be childless, or for an example, he's also one of those who is quite extreme when it comes to, you know, the choices of women in terms of their work and things like that. But we saw and spoke to an African-American man who was supporting J.D. Vance and is supporting Donald Trump, and everyone is claiming that God is in it on both sides. And so this is the kind of environment, you know, that this election is taking place under. And definitely, as we're just under 2 hours until the polls close, one other sense that we got is that in some quarters, many people had not made up their minds about who they wanted to vote for, and it literally has come down to the wire. And as that vote counting continues, it will be critical to watch then as the numbers count in and whether come in, and whether or not there'll be any shock that comes from certain states. We're yet to see.
Yeah. Now, as it would happen in elections, it happens here in South Africa as well. Some delays, certainly, in particular voting stations opening and so on and so forth. You've already mentioned that bomb scare, and we hear that scare could have come from Russia, and we also hear that others would have wanted to pose some legal challenges to some of the processes where there would have been technical glitches. What are you hearing in Georgia? Is there a likelihood of legal challenges to the processes, especially since Donald Trump earlier on already says that he is watching the process, and depending on whether the process is fair or not, he'll concede if he loses?
Well, this is exactly then what we're building up towards. So that briefing with the Fulton County Board of Officials is going to give us an update exactly on that, because they also deal with disputes just like the IEC would deal with disputes. Whether or not there's a legal challenge, they try and troubleshoot that as soon as possible. Another issue that we saw at Buckhead Library, much like what we saw as well during our election, is that there was a bit of a muddling up with the dresses. So people would come to a voting station and then they get there and they told no, they're registered elsewhere, but they were told then from 5 o'clock our time they would be able to vote anywhere. And whether or not that will be a bone of contention for someone like Donald Trump, we're going to see. But we'll be hearing then from these officials whether or not there are any legal challenges that have been filed, what kind of objections have they received throughout the day, and whether or not they're having any other issues with some of the voting stations. But so far from where we were, there didn't seem to be any incidents. As you can see, as I've mentioned, there's a lot of security, but even the officials at all the voting stations, they received a particularly bolstered kind of security training, if I could put it that way, in terms of how to de-escalate any kind of tensions. And so we'll hear then from the officials here as they wrap it up for the day, what they have to say about what they've had to deal with. But as I speak to you right now, behind me in the Fulton County, the counting has already begun, and as has been promised by officials here in Georgia, they're anticipating to complete that counting before the end of the night. So preliminary results will be out in Georgia, Atlanta, before we go to bed.
Asking myself, is it too early to have these watch parties? Are they going to see a significant number of those votes coming in? Of course, there's been some early votes that would have come in, some 78 million of them. Would they be in a position to really have these watch parties?
Well, it's the tradition to have the watch parties because, as you know, everybody who did their early voting via in-mail or in person, their ballots would have been collected, but they wouldn't have been counted. Today was the official day that they would have started counting, so they would have started opening the ballots and started counting. So as it stands at 17:51, where we are, a lot of the votes have been counted throughout the day in the various counties. As I've said, here in Fulton County, they've been counting the entire day, and so those results are already going to start coming in thick and fast, and that's the purpose of those watch parties. You start getting preliminary results from Pennsylvania, Arizona, here in Georgia, in North Carolina. All those swing states are what are going to be monitored, and that's why we keep having these maps every time the elections take place. Okay, the reds are leading here, and then it changes, and then it's the blues that are leading in a particular state as those election results trickle in the same way that we would with our elections dashboard back home. You start having those numbers trickling in. I suppose the only difference here in the culture is that they actually watch this take place televised live, as opposed to perhaps with us going to the IEC app and continuously refreshing the app. There's a group of people who come together and continuously watch the results come in.
Much appreciated. Ziyanda Ngcobo live for us there tonight. She's still in Atlanta, Georgia, where she'll be getting that briefing on the continuing voting there. Those polls closing at least in the next 2 hours or so.